Hey everyone. In this episode, we invite back lawyer Nicki Vander Meulen to talk about some of the legal issues around hiring practices. If you're keeping up on current events like we are, you know there are a lot of executive orders and court cases about legal protections that are making headlines right now. But we double-checked everything in this episode with Nicki, and all of the things she says about legal employment protections are still up to date as of this episode's release. But as always, we're a podcast, not official legal counsel, so you should stay in touch with your own lawyers for any of the actual legal advice that you need. Enjoy the show. Welcome to Diverse Joy, a podcast that infuses science, practical skills, and most of all, joy into diversity discussions. My co-host is the artistly, curly, flowy Dr. Amber Nelson with the fab hair.
And my co-host is the sequined and colorful Dr. William Cox.
And today we're inviting back the undeterred, unbent, unbroken special guest, Nicki Vander Meulen.
Thank you for the invite. I really appreciate being here.
And to reintroduce her a bit, or to remind our longtime listeners, Nicki is a lawyer. Mm-hmm. She is also a member of the school board for the MMSD, which stands for Madison Metropolitan School District. And a little personal background factage about her. So Nicki is autistic and has cerebral palsy, which gives her personal lived experiences with both physical and developmental disabilities. Which she has turned into part of her life's calling to be a fierce champion for people with disabilities. She's also an amazing ally to the LGBT community, communities of color, and beyond. So we're excited to have her back.
Yeah. I'm so excited to be here.
So this is our June episode. Yep. So we're all decked out for Pride Month.
Yes, got the sparkles.
Got the sparkles and the colors.
Yeah. Got the colors. We got the sparkles. Awesome.
All right. So as always, we start with kind of sharing something that's bringing us joy. So Nicki, what's bringing you joy this month?
What's bringing me joy is I'm holding up my bracelet with the infinity clasp. This is the neurodiversity symbol. And the neurodiversity symbol is what's being used by autistic individuals to represent us. The puzzle piece that you often see was not designed for individuals who are autistic and autistic individuals. In fact, we don't see ourselves as a puzzle or need to be figured out.
Yeah, so the choosing that kind of had the implication that there's something...
Right.
Where there's a missing piece.
There's a missing piece, or that you're an enigma or something to figure out.
So, whereas the neurodiversity is we've always been here.
Right.
And we always will be here.
Right. That's good. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off and asking a question, but I know that the puzzle piece was a really big one for Autism Speaks. Are they adopting a new symbol or no?
The Autism Speaks does not...
Nicki does not like autism.
Is not a big fan of the autism community. And no, unfortunately, I wish they were changing it. They're not.
Okay.
But Autism Speaks' main goal is to find a cure for autism.
Oh, see. Yeah, I didn't know that.
The problem is I don't think I'm dying.
It sounds like they don't want autism to speak anymore. They're trying to find a cure.
Right, exactly.
Autism speaks for not autistic people.
For autistic people, yeah, no kidding. All right,
so
that's beautiful.
You got that bracelet and you said a friend made it for you,
A friend of mine from high school, Dion Scherer, has a beautiful bead company, and she makes her own jewelry. And her son, Atticus, who's wonderful, was recently diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. So she made these bracelets and donated proceeds to his school and to what's called ASAN, the Autism Self-Advocacy Network.
Oh, that's great.
Wonderful.
That's
are they
awesome.
on social medias?
They are.
You don't have to remember it perfectly now, but we can make sure to figure that out.
I will definitely.
And so when we do post our socials, we can make sure to tag them, and we can tag them with a picture with your bracelet.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely. Because her work is amazing, and she truly understands the community, and Atticus is a huge hockey fan and big fishing. Big into fishing.
Love that. Love that.
Good old Wisconsin.
Fantastic. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Nicki. And Will, how about you? What's your joy?
Well, sticking with our kind of jewelry theme. So I'm wearing a couple of things that I want to shout out that bring me joy. First, so similar to Nicki's bracelet, I am wearing a necklace that was made by a dear friend, Shijo Z. And her art, she makes lots of different kinds of jewelry, but the main thing is these paintings that have this kind of flowy, multicolored design. You can follow her at art by Shijo Z. Shijo is spelled Xizhou, and Z is spelled, her last name is Xie, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing them a bit wrong. But she makes amazing art. She's also a great ally to many communities. She is Chinese American herself, so another avenue of diversity. Also, I am wearing a pin that I got from the Wisconsin LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And very I got this because our nonprofit that this podcast is sponsored by, the nonprofit called Inequity Agents of Change, was admitted to the Wisconsin LGBT Chamber of Commerce as a LGBT-owned business.
Yay.
So yay!
It's awesome.
Awesome. And so they sent me this cool pin this year.
Lapel pin. I love it.
Last year, actually, but I'm wearing it now. So yeah, a few different things. Also a pin that I got from my dear friend and podcast co-host, Dr. Amber Nelson.
Yes.
That has pronouns, my pronouns on it, he, him. And I know it's my joy, but Amber, do you want to shout out the artist that makes these pins that you like?
Yeah, well, I get them from Loving Empire, which is a Pacific Northwest owned company. And a lot of the products come from the artists, specifically from Portland, but also other spaces from the Pacific Northwest. And so they're wood pins and carved with the pronouns, which I really love.
Nice. And across this long season, over this 14-month period of season 2, each of our guests, Amber, got them pronoun pins with their pronouns.
Yes.
And it's been very nice. Yeah, we're all wearing them. Yep. Which you might be able to see in the videos.
Yeah.
So those are my joys. Just a few little bits of jewelries and pins from cool people and organizations. What about you, Amber? What's bringing you joy this June?
I know I'm kind of breaking the frame from what we're wearing to something else. So I think I've mentioned going to camp a couple of times, but June is the time that I go to Camp Ukando is what it's called. And I am not a camp counselor, but I'm on the mental health team, and we're called the Rainbow Connection, and which I love. And I wear rainbow clothes like every day. And but the camp specifically is for kids who have cancer and their siblings. And so this is this time where kids get to come, and kids that have dealt with really major things, adult conditions and issues, and get to come and be around other kids that understand that experience, have gone through that experience, or have been impacted by it in some way. And so they get to just be kids. And it is, I can't talk about it enough. I could talk about it all day for weeks on end, but what an incredible experience. And I just love being able to go. Wonderful. Yeah, I go and especially as not a counselor, but on the mental health team, that I get to connect with like all of the kids and not just my camp, like not just my cabin. Yeah. And I get to support because all kinds of stuff comes up, right, at camp, and they see their friends and memories are brought up. But like I also just get to center joy again, where even in a hard time or a hard condition, that we get to center love, joy, and fun. And it is, like I said, last year was my first year going, and a friend of mine from postdoc reached out, and I was like, can I also come? I'd love to be part of this. And it's just been really amazing to be part of that team and part of this. There's a nonprofit organization called Ukando, and they are incredible. It's based in Oregon. And I can't say enough good things about them, how much they really care about people and how much they invest in them. So, so camp happens a little bit later this month. And so I'm already gearing up for going and preparing for a week out, kind of camping in cabins outside. So really looking forward to that.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yay. That sounds so amazing.
I think it is. Awesome. It's really incredible.
All right. Well, so we had Nicki on 2 times previously. So you're a 3-timer now.
Wow.
You're only you're a
second,
third timer. So you and Sandy Eichel have now, after this episode, you'll both have been on for 3 times. Every time we've talked to you, brought in some of your legal expertise, which is always wonderful, and a different perspective from what Amber and I have as scientists and practitioners and clinicians in this realm. But one big area where I have encountered issues where people, what they think they should be doing, I'm pretty sure doesn't go along with what laws say, is with employment. And so often, diversity related and bias related topics come up in employment because people are wanting to increase their diversity in their organization. But there are legal guidelines around this that even the most well-intentioned people who have equity and diversity and inclusion in their minds can make some missteps. There are things that are illegal to talk about or ask about in the hiring process. And I know that you are an expert in this area. Yeah. And so I asked you to come and talk about kind of fair employment guidelines and what some of the legal rules are with regard to what you can and can't talk about in employment situations.
And thank you for doing that. Yeah. Very simply, people, normally it's the most diverse and most well-meaning people who tend to slip up on this because they want to be all-inclusive.
Like it's less likely we don't want to hire a Black person. It's more likely we do.
We do, right.
Right. And either is an illegal thing to even talk about.
And that sentence in a hiring context would be unacceptable.
Right.
Under Title VI, bringing up race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, creed, disability, and religion, if I didn't already say it, and race, of course, are not allowed.
Right.
Right. And marital status is another
Marital status has never been allowed.
Oh, really? Never.
Never.
So the way I understood it is, especially for women in the workplace, people would ask about marital status because apparently illegally, because they'd be afraid like, oh, this woman's going to come, then she's going to get married and leave
or have kids.
And so leave. Asking about it. Yeah.
So it was never legal to begin with. It's businesses tended to do it. Or ask, are you planning on getting pregnant?
Right.
Yeah, anytime soon.
Right.
Yeah. And that was after, asking about gender things was supposedly was illegal. And then that was how people were kind of getting around or trying to.
And that's the thing. People try to find ways to do it because we're human beings. Naturally, we stereotype into groups. It's how we learn. But stereotypes on the protected classes and employment just do not mix.
And generally speaking, stereotypes in this context are going to be to the detriment of members of historically less powerful groups.
It will always be that way. The stereotypes will be seen as that because that's what it is. It's a generalization. And when you look at a group of people in a marginalized group, you're only going to see the average. You're not going to see the exceptional
And in a hiring situation, you're supposed to be making the judgment about that particular person, their qualities, not the qualities of their group, the broader data or correlations or anything about their group. You're not supposed to be generalizing beyond what their talents are or are not, or what they're bringing.
And oftentimes
that's true morally and
ethically
and legally.
Well, legally, here's the thing. Legally, we're supposed to create a fair playing ground where people are hired for their merits. Well, like most things in law, it sounds really good on paper. On practice is where it gets really difficult. Because can I give preference? Can I not give preference? Here's what I always say is you could say we encourage diverse individuals to apply. That is a way you can say it. You cannot say blacks and minorities will have preference.
Right.
The number of people who have done that, it never ends well. It always ends up in some sort of litigation. This does not mean I'm denying that there's discrimination in the hiring process. It's built in, it's baked in our society, unfortunately, because we make stereotypes in general. But what it is it tries to provide a playing ground and a framework. So the main thing we need to know is, can an employer refuse to hire a person because of a disability? Answer, it depends.
Oh, so with disability, it has... Okay. What does it depend on?
It depends on if the person is reasonable. In 49 states, it depends on if a person is reasonably required, can meet the reasonable requirements of the job, meaning they could do what's called the essential functions of the job. Those are the core decisions and abilities that are needed to perform the job. I say 49 states because Wisconsin, the one we are filming this in, is the one unique state.
Oh, what's unique about it?
Wisconsin Crystal Lake Cheese Factory versus IRC, Labor Industry Review Commission, specifically states that you cannot, that the essential functions is not essential. That if someone else can help you to perform and you can do the majority of the tasks, then you are not allowed to be discriminated against.
Oh, so in Wisconsin...
So you can have some support.
Yes. So in Wisconsin, it's not that we're worse than all the other states. We're a little bit better.
A little better. I love that.
What happened was an individual was in a severe accident and became a quadriplegic. She could do some of the job and the verbal parts, and her sister did the other portions, awesome. And they fired both of them.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And one for advocating for the other.
Right.
One for advocating for the other. And the courts ruled no. Then this went up to the Seventh Circuit, which is the circuit that covers Wisconsin, which is it's based in Illinois and Chicago. And the 3 panel judges found that no, that it isn't enough to not be able to do essential function. If you can do some of them, then you can. Now, here's the one caveat on that is safety.
What's interesting when we're talking about can they reasonably do the tasks required for the job? We had this conversation several times in academia as well, especially in graduate school, right? And so we sat with our disability access services a lot about how do we accommodate? How do we provide appropriate accommodations for somebody while also still holding a specific expectation or standard of what somebody has to be able to accomplish or do in order to say, yes, you have fulfilled the requirements of the degree and can fill and still go out and be a psychologist, right? And I think that there are a lot of programs, institutions that do that in ways that are not very good. They just kind of say this is the standard, whether you do it or not, and don't really give appropriate accommodations.
But happened here.
Right. But I also see people going on the other end of kind of just removing expectation and say like, oh, accommodation is just letting you do whatever you want to. And I was like, well, that's not right either. And so we have to find, figuring out that the balance of being able to say like, okay, can you do this with support? And you're the one. So for instance, one of the big things in clinical psychology right now with a friend of mine, Alette Coble-Temple, who has CP. And so her mobility is impaired, right? And she uses a wheelchair for mobility. And one of the essential quote unquote tasks of clinical psychology is doing psychological testing, right? And so, but she's unable to do some of the physical manipulation of the tasks, but can she have somebody else administer and do all of the interpretation and do all the observations and be able to provide a report? Absolutely. Does that mean she can't be a psychologist because she can't physically manipulate a task? Absolutely not. And there are a lot of folks that are programs and spaces that might do that might create that barrier that says like, well, you're not administering the assessment. So, or again, removing the requirement from her learning how to be a good clinician around interpretation and how to do a psychological test, And so anyway, I think it's a really interesting line, right? And especially figuring out how do we go about, how do organizations, whether that's an academic institution or a job, figure that out and establish what are the essential tasks and what does that look like when we're making accommodations for folks?
The best way to do that is you have to ask the individual. There's no way around that. We can look it up. We can wiki it. We can just ask.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, I'll have people talk for me, talk over me, talk to my mother rather than me. And it's like, ask me directly.
Yep.
We find ways to do it. But with academia, oftentimes the disability community is one of the last bastions of discrimination there is. Yeah. Because we're not asking for carte blanche. We are not asking for no rules. Yeah. We want the standards. Please do not get us wrong. Yeah. We just do it differently.
There's this comedian, I forget his name, but he has cerebral palsy and he uses an SGD or an AAC for his comedy is literally all about speaking, right?
It's beautiful.
It's really, really great. So it takes there's a slight delay because he's typing it out on his phone, but then his phone and his device speaks it for him. So even if she was going for public speaking, that shouldn't necessarily discount her from that
I
either.
apologize. I didn't even
disappointing part for me is I had these problems back in 2001 when I was here from the disability organization at the time, which has gotten much better. But at the time, stated that accommodations, no, we don't do that. Getting the accommodations made, I had my tests lost and be told, oh, well, we couldn't do that. The day I graduated, they're like, oh, you're actually graduated? Oh. They actually said that to my mom.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought there would be more progress.
Right.
But the Disability Innovation Center was just founded last year.
Wow.
So, yes, we have had a Disability Student Service Center, but we're finally having students getting involved and saying, we want these students here. Yeah. They belong here. They deserve to live here. Now, to go back to your original point, which is what can universities do? Here's the thing. Stop making assumptions on competency. 2, what we don't need is to make an easy, watered-down curriculum and then say we're accessible. That's not it.
Right.
You meet with the student. This, just like in high schools and elementary schools, an individual education plan, what we call here in Wisconsin visa, but it's called multiple things elsewhere, is individually designed for that person. I know it's a lot more work for HR, but plain and simple, individuals require individual accommodations. Yeah. And oftentimes these accommodations are reasonable, but they're not often provided.
Yeah. Yeah. And my question too on there's the academic piece. What's the responsibility, bringing it back to employment? What is the responsibility of employers providing accommodation for employees?
Here's the key. Unlike in elementary, middle, and high school, in which the school has what's a responsibility called child find to determine the disability, starting college on and in the workplace, there is no responsibility for disclosure. An employer can't be sued for what they don't know.
Right.
So if you do not tell them, I understand the need for anonymity sometimes, but you can't go, I want to be anonymous and get accommodations.
Right.
I wish you could, but that is not, there are too many invisible disabilities.
Yep. I've had the same conversation again in academic spaces, that a lot of times students will not want to involve themselves with DAS or the disability access services because they don't want people to know about whatever their medical or a condition or other conditions or things that they need accommodations for. But then we're like, we can't get you the accommodations if we don't have this, if people don't know about it, if there isn't anything on file for you, then we can't give you what you actually need, and we want to support you. So it sounds like it's similar for employment, that you have to tell somebody. They have to have it because they're not responsible for the things that they don't know, right?
Absolutely. And here's the other thing. We're in a society where we don't want to label people. I hate to tell you, these labels are needed now in academics for funding on disability, but also because unemployment, in order to get those accommodations, you need the documentation. And trying to get accommodations when you're diagnosed as an adult is much, much harder.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about, again, hiring practices and trying to mitigate maybe some of the bias that happens or comes in when it comes to, one, your employer needs to know what kinds of accommodation, whatever your background is, disability, medical condition, or whatnot, is in order to provide the appropriate accommodations. As a lawyer, do you recommend disclosing that during the interview process or once you've been employed, so that then they know what kind of accommodations
I've
you
always
need?
done it in the final interview, but it is up to the individual. Best time is between the final interview and when you first start. And I've had good and I've had bad. The one time I didn't tell till I first started was at the U.S. Capitol, and the individual stated I got the job out of fraud and tried to take all my job responsibilities. So I now do it in the final interview.
Interesting.
And P.S. I reprogrammed their phone system instead.
Wow.
They gave me my job responsibilities back.
Wow. So, and then, I didn't mean to derail us on some of those things around, but I just think it's important for folks to know about. I just think it's really interesting when we're thinking about hiring practices and where some of that employment law comes in and where some of the discrimination can happen and the bias can
Where
come
the
out.
biggest comes in is in the questionnaire and how you answer a lot of the questions.
Interesting. Okay.
And how you ask them. And there are ways that you can ask them that don't involve, are you unable? Do you do this? There are ways to ask and say, to instead focus on what tasks you are requiring.
Yeah. Well, that's even interesting too, because one of the things that we've called out as psychologists, particularly in the state where I went, or where I'm licensed in Oregon, on some of the application forms, just for my license as a clinical psychologist, had questions specifically around, am I able to walk? Are you able to carry? Are you able to do these things? And I'm like, none of those things are essential functions as a psychologist. Why is this even on the application for my licensure? Like, this is very interesting that this even exists in this paperwork.
And there could be different reasons. They might not be to deny the license. It might be equivalent to like demographics so that they can say what percentage of clinicians we license. But what you're highlighting is if that were the case, they should say that.
Right.
So, that's something that I learned in a lot of my kind of research. Sometimes just telling people why you're asking the question
100%.
can solve a lot of the problems. Like, hey,
Absolutely.
like in your specific example, like psychologists come in all shapes and sizes and walks of life, and maybe walks of life isn't the way to phrase it when you're asking if they can walk or not.
Right.
But we are just trying to understand the breadth of our community in this
community.
Yeah. And sharing this will help us understand that better. We're not going to be denying your license based on this information. Right?
But the fear is there.
Yeah,
right. 100%.
Absolutely.
I didn't see a psychologist for 3 years when I was in law school, because at the time there was a lawsuit going through in which a lawyer's license was up to, they were not going to grant it because she didn't pass character and fitness because she had psychological treatment, and they stated it affected her legal judgment.
So that's just a bias against seeking therapy in general.
Therapy, right. Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
That's wild.
It was terrifying.
Yeah. Wow.
But these kind of biases, people don't often mean badly.
A way I've seen the question, which I'm guessing is probably the right way to do it, but I want the group's ideas. It would describe whatever the essential tasks are that the job requires. Are you able to do these tasks with or without accommodation?
Yes.
And the answer to the question is just yes or no. Yes, I can do the task, or no. The with or without is, I'm saying yes, I can do this task and I'll need an accommodation. But the fact, it's not asking you whether you need an accommodation
or not.
So then you can answer yes after the fact. You can be like, yeah, the yes is with accommodations. And so I've seen that question. And you think that's a good way of doing it?
That way of doing it, because these are the that way you're not asking, well, you have to single out if you need the accommodation.
Right.
You're answering, can you do the functions of the job?
Yeah. And then some people who need an accommodation, if you didn't have that with or without accommodations phrase, you'd be like, well, no, not unless I have the accommodations. And then that forces them to disclose. So yeah, I like asking that question that way.
I really think that's a good one. Another good one is, what skills do you bring to the job in an oral interview? I really like that because it allows the person to tell what they can do.
Yeah, that's really good.
That you could focus on versus
one is a strengths-based approach, right? Like, and I think, well, again, I have my own bias, as particularly as a clinical psychologist, is to take strengths-based approaches and hiring practices or admissions practices. Thinking about that strengths-based. What are you bringing? Not necessarily what are you not bringing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't want to derail if there's more we want to talk about with disability specifically, but I do have some topics and questions related to other parts, additional forms of
employment.
So is that
that sounds wonderful?
Great.
So back to the idea that some of the people who violate the laws around what you can talk about in an employment process often are the people who are kind of the most motivated for diversity and inclusion on the positive side.
Yeah.
So for instance, saying, "Oh, we want to hire a person of color or an LGBT person." How can we ask those questions? And I have a bit of an answer that I want us to reflect on. How can we kind of try to encourage diversity in the hiring process legally without breaking those rules? And the way that I've seen it done are two related things. One is encouraging people to talk about lived experiences.
Yes.
And that's something that it's in some ways it's a little bit of a code word, like a little code term. When we start talking about lived experiences, that's a very diversity DEI kind of term, and it's just encouraging everyone to do that. And then people of color, LGBT folks, people with disabilities will bring in some of that. So it's a way that they can choose to disclose that if they want to, but the employer is not directly asking for it. And then the second is diversity statements. So a lot of employers require everyone, like I'm thinking of academic jobs especially, because that's something that I've been a part of, to submit a statement about what diversity means to them. Everyone should be able to answer that question. That's a core value of the institution you're coming a part of. Doesn't matter if you're straight and white and don't have a disability.
Right.
Thinking about diversity and diverse values and being able to talk about it can be, if I'm understanding correctly, can be something legally that they're asked about, they talk about. That's also a place where someone who chooses could disclose their own identities, perhaps. If they wanted to emphasize those lived experiences.
They're both excellent. I prefer the first because the second one, you could wordsmith and make you sound like you're tolerant of things, which you're actually not tolerant of. A talented writer can actually know how to phrase something in a way that makes them sound incredibly for diversity when they're not.
Like in a diversity statement.
Right.
But when you're asking about lived experiences,
what's your lived
they have
experiences?
to be talking about.
Especially if you're looking to explicitly try to expand diversity. Getting at the lived experience gives you more insight.
So on the legal side of things, because at some point that gets dicey because if you're like, I get that asking it's okay, but then when you're considering someone's application and they've mentioned some of their identities, you can't exactly take those into account. So where is
the line is basically on race, we don't know anymore. As of the U.S. Supreme Court decision outlawing affirmative action, we honestly, I wish I could answer that question.
So the courts haven't figured out where the new line is because of that.
We still have Title VI, which provides some guidance of you can't discuss race, sexual orientation, gender, creed, disability, those categories. So that provides some.
Okay.
But it doesn't do enough. What I suggest is looking at state law.
Okay.
Because state laws often are broader than the federal on what they include. For example, Wisconsin was the first state in 1982 to prevent discrimination against gay employees.
Interesting. Wow.
And that was stronger than the federal government language for many
Wisconsin.
years.
Yay.
That was before I was born.
That's twice that Wisconsin is doing something better.
We were also the first, Madison was the first city to become a sanctuary city for trans and non-binary people.
Wow, I had no idea.
I had that on my list of potential joys for future episodes.
Wonderful.
But I'm just going to bring it in now.
You've used it now.
But it's still wonderful and something to
we were
celebrated.
the first.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
What it comes down to is this. The other way you treat people the way you want to be treated, of course. But the other thing that you ask is, what can you do? What can you show me that you've done? And do it on experience. The more you do it based on lived experience, the less likely it's going to be court challenged because it's what the person has done.
Right.
And I think of it, so as a white appearing person with a mixed background, the listeners know my kind of complicatedness. The way I think of it, I also have lived experiences of kind of growing up in predominantly Black schools and things like that I could discuss. And so when I think in a broader sense, like if someone were looking for racial diversity, I can say some things that might have interested them. Other white people could do that same sort of thing. Say, hey, I've worked with inner city youth, people of color. They can still have answers to those questions that could be valid, that could be like... And as someone who's done hiring, I had that in my head as a value. And I'm like, I don't just want to hire white people in my research lab that's about prejudice and bias. But you know what? I had almost no applicants of color for this one job that I'm thinking of that I hired. But I had some white applicants that were just so deeply committed and were able to outline specific, concrete things that had happened to them and that they've done and that they've been involved in. And this hiring, I did end up hiring a white person, but he was fantastic. And so when I think of, in law, I'm acting like I know what the law is about. I'm not a lawyer, but you think of like litmus tests, right? Like what is the legal test to see if could a white person fill out this question and meet the kinds of requirements you're looking for? And I think the lived experiences question provides everyone that opportunity.
Yeah,
exactly. Because we are not specifying. We are saying, I want to know what you've done.
Right. Yeah. So I have a question on, again, hiring practices on the whole. Where does personality and like fit, organizational fit come in, you know, when let's say somebody technically meets the minimum requirements, right? Let's say you have an applicant that meets the minimum requirements and another applicant that maybe has way more lived experience or way more experience on paper. But when you meet them, you're like, yeah, this person maybe is more qualified, but I would much rather work with this person. And that's kind of this qualitative, you can't necessarily put it on paper type thing. And maybe this person happens to be a representative of a marginalized community or maybe not. But where does that come in? And how do you, if then somebody says like, this is, how do you, if somebody then says, well, this was racial discrimination or reverse racism or whatever this was, because you just hired them because they're Black and they don't have the same level of experience as me, or vice versa. How does that piece fit in?
Because you can't quantify those kind of personality
that
things.
That personal, like, was just a better fit. Like this, I liked this person more.
What you do is you discuss cultural competence of the organization. And then you do in-person interviews on how they interact with the team, not just how they interact with the interviewer.
So talking about that,
the interview with the team.
Yeah.
But see, you know, it's a cut both ways kind of thing. Because as you described it, was it racism? Was it like reverse racism or discrimination against a white person? Because, you know, cultural fit.
Right.
I mean, part of the other things we've talked about with bias and diversity is thinking that someone fits can mean thinking they're similar to me.
Right.
And so if we're in an all white workplace, that might mean picking the white person.
Right.
Or it could be, you know, a personality thing where actually it's the person of color who fits better.
Right.
But it could cut both ways. Right. And so in wanting to protect everyone and have everyone have equity and fairness, it's complicated.
Yeah.
There's not an easy answer.
No. Here's the thing. People want a completely straight playing field. That's never going to happen in society.
Well, you know, when they exclude gay people, it's completely straight.
I walked into it. And that was beautiful.
But you mean completely fair or equitable?
They want a completely fair and equitable process. And on paper, you could create one. Here's the problem. People are people.
Yep.
Yes.
They will end up creating bias without even knowing it. Right. And that's 100%. Why these kind of trainings are as important as they are. Because you can't prevent what you don't see.
Right.
What you don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
That's super helpful.
So let's take a little break now, and then we'll get back with some story time.
Great.
Does that sound good?
Sounds wonderful.
Hey everyone! We now have Diverse Joy merch available for purchase. There are Diverse Joy mugs that are dishwasher and microwave safe, some really nice large tote bags that are great for grocery shopping, very cozy embroidered hoodies, and a variety of comfy t-shirts. Whenever Amber or I wear one of our Diverse Joy shirts, people comment on how it makes them excited to see something related to joy and diversity. People are hungry for joy around diversity topics. So get some merch and help us spread the joy. We also made a PDF of free downloadable cards for Diverse Joy Bingo. You won't win any prizes, but it can be fun to play as you watch or listen to an episode. Get all of these at biashabit.com/store or just go to diversejoy.com and click the store link. All proceeds go toward helping us produce the show, and you can also make a donation to our nonprofit through the site to help us out even more. Now, back to the show. Welcome back from break, everybody. Yeah. Amber, you had a little more that maybe you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, well, I know. I think it's going back to some of those things around, again, employment and how we're hiring. So one of my questions was about, you know, those statements that some employers will say, like, we're an equal opportunity employer, right? And like all of these things, and then they lay all of these things out. Where and how that comes in when it comes to hiring, and how does that give them more room and space to be able to say, like, hey, we explicitly said we're equal opportunity, so we can so we're, I don't know, I'm maybe trying to be more intentional about making the space diverse, or I don't know. I think I'm just wondering where that comes in and how that plays out in support of, or does it make things harder legally?
Pre before we got rid of affirmative action, it meant something.
Yeah.
Now that we have gotten rid of affirmative action legally, the statement has a lot less meaning, unfortunately, to it, because anyone could say it.
Yeah.
And now it's primarily lip service.
Yeah.
And what it'll take is the courts to be able to sort it out.
Well, and I think, that's interesting. And I keep coming back to that, the affirmative action and what that means. From your perspective, I know you keep saying, like, I don't really have an answer right now because it's still working its way through the system, essentially. But how do you see kind of this overturning of affirmative action playing itself out in employment?
I think it's going to be disastrous.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I hate to be pessimistic, but this may be one of the most long-standing misapplications, in my view, by the U.S. Supreme Court to deny the fact that racism is not baked in to the educational system when it's clearly evident that it is just saying we're going to pretend and ignore it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The world isn't like that. And by doing that, what you've created is a system of confusion.
That allows,
and you will end up with more problems. And it'll take another good 25 years to go the other way.
Yeah.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, it really is. And I appreciate that because, again, I think when I was in academia, sitting with that from an admissions standpoint and trying to figure out, like, what do we do? Like, we also have this commitment. We also have, like, institutional and field commitments and expectations around diversity and inclusion. And how do we do this with this kind of with affirmative action being changing. And I don't know. I think I don't have that. I don't have the longstanding history and I don't have that mind, but wondering what that looked like. So appreciate you talking about that.
I wish I knew more. I do know that we're just going to do one plug, which is please vote, because people think their vote doesn't matter. You end up choosing the judges because you choose the electoral candidate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Excellent.
That's my voting plug for that.
Right. It's important for everybody to vote. So excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Nicki.
Yep.
So one of the things that we do every episode is we kind of have a negative and more positive story, and we're kind of move into story time. So Nicki, I know you have at least one of I think you're doing both of our stories today. Yeah. So you want to start with our more negative story? Yes.
This organization is a good organization who was trying to do the right thing on hiring. And they really were trying to. They wanted it was a school district who wanted a diverse superintendent. However, Title VI, again, as I explained, cannot mention race in a hiring context.
Right.
And there were statements made that stated they would never hire white people because they haven't done enough.
Wow.
Haven't experienced
enough.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
And you kind of go, you can't say that. Another comment was, well, we need to have someone that matches the demographics of our incoming students. I understand that, and it's an excellent point. You can't go there.
Right.
And, thinking of the kind of hiring language, like the lived experience thing we talked about, you could have a statement. The general demographics of our school district are this, spell them out, in what ways would that inform your candidacy?
Right.
Or how would your lived experiences prepare you for this kind of a student body?
And absolutely. And that is huge. The other issue and the other way to do it is also, these are our students and, for example, certain skills like language skills. We want fluency in Spanish.
Right.
We want fluency or experience working with underprivileged groups. Right. Now, we say underprivileged. We can't say what group.
Right.
But you can say underprivileged. You can...
Couldn't you say working with racially diverse groups? because it's not talking about your own.
No,
the
it isn't. But the minute you say it, it causes a lawsuit. So we don't even say the word.
Oh, so it's not illegal. You're saying it's maybe not advisable.
Right.
It is completely legal. It is completely not advisable.
Right.
Because the minute you put that word in there, it goes straight to the EEOC.
And the EEOC is
Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Gotcha.
Gotcha.
And that's where that would go immediately.
Gotcha.
So we tend to avoid doing that.
Yeah. So saying other things like, under-resourced or underprivileged groups, fluency in Spanish is groups that are historically disadvantaged, and maybe giving some other context cues as to what we're talking about specifically, but without necessarily saying anything, without saying the words.
Right.
Yeah.
But to underline the core story, so hiring committee saying we can't hire someone white. I mean, that's obviously discriminatory and illegal.
Yeah.
Correct.
All right. So also don't do that anyway.
Don't do that. And again, going back to what you were saying, that the intent, there was positive intent there, right? There was really good
like, hey, we recognize a history of white people in these kinds of roles, and anything we could do to,
And that's the thing. The people who made that decision were very, very progressive on that issue.
Right.
They wanted to
be intentional about who they were bringing into the
Unfortunately, when it comes to law, the more intentional certain statements are, the more likely they are to be struck down in court.
That's really good to know from a legal standpoint. Yeah.
So you also have a kind of more positive story.
Really good one.
Yeah.
Talk a lot about my middle school because I had a lot of discrimination in middle school.
Yeah.
And my principal didn't totally understand at the time. About 10 years ago, I got a phone call from him asking to meet. He wanted to meet my mother and I. And he wanted to meet us so he could apologize. It seems his grandson was born with autism.
Okay.
And his grandson at the time was about 8 years old. He's now just about to start college. And he said, I didn't understand why you made as big a deal out of things.
Yeah.
I didn't know better.
Yeah.
And the guts that it took, you have to understand, Whitewater, Wisconsin is not a bastion of progressivism.
Right.
It just isn't. And people don't admit, hey, I was wrong. Not publicly like that.
Right.
But it was, hey, this is the situation. I didn't know.
Yeah, I made a mistake. Yeah.
For someone to be able to say that, I'm going to completely forgive you. Why? Because you didn't know.
Yeah.
And now you're doing better because you know better, to quote Maya Angelou. You know better now.
Yeah, exactly.
And just it's like, now at least we can keep going in the positive. Because as hard as this world is and it gets depressing, you got to have the positive role models. You have to have the people who've learned and know better.
Right.
And they're out there. Yeah. But oftentimes they're afraid to admit, I screwed up because they're afraid. Oh, then people think this of me.
Yep.
And not talk. Right. I'd rather have someone say, I said it. I was completely wrong.
I was wrong.
And these are how I've changed. Not just say I've changed.
Yeah.
These are how I've changed.
This
is what I am doing, which is what he said. This is. And I volunteer my time. I've been working on this. I teach other principals.
Yeah. That's huge. And we've talked about that too around one, there is some effort over time, right? So it requires some concerted effort over time. It requires an acknowledgement, but beyond just acknowledging, I have to do something about this. Now that I know better, I need to do better. Like Maya Angelou said. And it sounds like not only was this person able to acknowledge, oops, that was a miss. Now I get it. But I am now putting my next step forward and doing everything that I can to shift and change how I'm acting, how I'm behaving. I'm learning better. I'm also passing that information on to the next person and other educators and other spaces.
And you never quite know when it'll come back. And that's kind of the cool part. I have one additional story if I
Go for it.
Great.
It's not employment, but I'll explain. Yeah. I had an individual, his name was John Doe, because I have to, I do criminal defense. Yeah. But his was a child support issue. And I convinced him to apply for disability because he couldn't hold a job. A year later, he comes into my office to pay back the fee that he paid. And I said, I would never call this in. Yeah. He said, because of you, I knew how to apply and how to get disability. And I'm finally getting the services I need. So I want you to have this $40.
Aww.
Because it means that I know how to pay my debts back.
Aww.
That's sweet. Amazing. That's
I
amazing.
Still tear up.
Yeah, just thinking about that. That's
but he
huge.
was just, he didn't know that was an option.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, and that speaks to what the work that you do, right? But also, how that changed the ripple effects of the change. And we talk a lot about the ripple effects of our behaviors and our actions, how that shifts and changes somebody else's perspective and can change somebody's life. Like that changes this person's life and their livelihood and their ability to kind of move through, which then is going to impact, you said, child support. It's going to impact the ways in which they work and are with their child, how they can support their child. And so the ripple effects of those kinds of things are astronomical, as with the same with your principal, right? And the ripple effects of his being able to acknowledge and come to that place and moving forward.
Absolutely.
It's great. That's amazing. I love that. So thank you. Thank you for sharing those with us, Nicki. And as always, we always have a habit breaking skill. So Will, what's our skill for today?
Skip the question. You skipped the question, Amber.
Skip the question. The question. So our question for this month is, why are Heritage and Pride Months? Why do we have them, and why do they matter?
Why are they important? Yeah. Great question, and thank you to the person who sent it in, and also everyone listening. Send in your questions at diversejoy.com.
We love to answer them.
Most often Pride Months are for groups. So here we are in Gay Pride Month. Being able to just kind of exist as oneself is something that the LGBT plus community fought for so long. Just talking about the history of Pride Month in general, a lot of people trace it to the Stonewall riots, where LGBT folks were being persecuted and raided by the police just for existing, just for having a place to gather. There's a meme and t-shirt that I see all the time, like to kind of remember our history, remember that Pride was a riot originally, the Stonewall riots. And, people died and were injured and they fought for the right to exist. And so fast forward to today, it's not that prejudice has been eliminated or anything like that, but we have things so much better than we did back then. And so being able to walk in public and be who we are and be proud is hard won. And it's really a wonderful thing. And so sometimes with that kind of question, like, why are they important? There's kind of a flip side to it. So sometimes with Pride Months, there are people who have kind of very reactive sorts of issues. For instance, it's not story time, but one little story for me. There was someone who it was kind of an acquaintance, but I was friends with them on social media, and they kind of posted this meme kind of putting Gay Pride Month down. And basically it was, well, I heard that this is Pride Month was the caption. So I put up the flag to show my pride, and it was an American flag, right? Which I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being proud of being an American, but it was clearly just kind of trying to insult LGBT pride,
right?
And there was another kind of similar one where people were complaining. They're like, oh, this is Gay Pride Month. Well, what about our soldiers overseas? What about the military? And luckily, I didn't have to kind of rebut these person, because a lot of comedians picked this up and TV shows were like, actually May is Military Pride Month.
Right.
And there's Military Family Appreciation. Yep. There are actually about 5 different Veterans Day and so on. There are 5 different months that have different kind of labels for appreciating the military and so on. And the fact that the person was getting mad about LGBT pride, being like, oh, we don't appreciate the military, but didn't know that actually there are these several things, kind of shows that it's really about prejudice against the LGBT community, not really appreciation for the military.
Right. As July is going to be Disability Pride Month.
Right.
Yeah. And
Disability Pride. What it means to me.
And why is it important?
It goes back to the Capitol Crawl for me.
Yeah,
Capitol 100%. Crawl, which I spoke on in an early episode, is individuals who climbed up the courthouse, climbed up the stairs of the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah.
Because to prove it wasn't accessible.
It wasn't accessible to prove that the Americans with Disabilities Act must be passed.
Right.
That doesn't happen. I don't have rights, but go back.
Yeah.
If the 504 sit-ins, which is a group of sit-ins and protests on disability, that almost failed. Except the Black Panthers and Brad Lomax got involved and filled it.
Yep.
And provided the generators, provided the equipment, provided the food, and took over a building in San Francisco for a month.
Yeah. And for folks, if you haven't seen Crip Camp, please watch it. It's incredible. But, I think it was a really great documentary, but it also showed, it talked about and highlights, the effort for anybody to occupy a building for a month is an astronomical feat, but particularly for those that have disabilities, where there were so many folks that needed really specialty things in order to just ventilators and mattresses and things in order for their bodies to sustain that, was just incredible. And for me, as you're talking about Disability Pride Month, that's what Pride Months and Heritage Months are all about, is being able to celebrate the successes and celebrate the, I talked about the ancestors, the shoulders that we stand on or that we are elevated by in order to move forward. And that's what these months are about, is saying like, man, my ancestors, the people that came before me did this in order for us to be here. Yes, we have so much more work to do. Yes, there's a lot to do. And let's celebrate the work that we're currently doing and the work that has been done to get to where we are, and to celebrate, and the sacrifices and things that folks made in order for us to get to where we are.
Yeah. And I believe you also said in a previous episode, Amber, you are your ancestors' wildest dream, living and succeeding and being the amazing thing that you are, living legend.
Living legends.
And here's the thing. My right to an education wasn't guaranteed until I was 12 years old.
Right.
When the ADA passed in 1990. Yeah. And it had a grace period, so it went into effect in 91, but it was passed in 90.
Our producer pulled up a note for us. So a lot of the things related to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Capitol Crawl and all of those things. If you want to learn more about them, go back to season 1, episode 10 of Diverse Joy, where we talked about that more in depth, but it still bears reminding. And one more thing for me about kind of Pride, Heritage, Visibility Months is that visibility aspect.
Absolutely.
Because, if we're talking about LGBT plus pride, LGBT kids, as I've said several times on the podcast, most often they're born to straight families.
Right.
And so they're not learning about their own identities as much from their parents, the way people of say racial groups, various racial groups would. And so kind of pride, that visibility that we see in Pride Month for LGBT plus folks, is also for those kids who are already maybe are realizing they're LGBT plus, but also the ones who aren't yet at that stage to start seeing, oh, there are people living their lives in this way. And then someday that might end up being them.
I have one story on that need to tell.
Please.
There was a very strict attorney, and he never really talked to anyone. And after I announced my candidacy for school board, he stopped me, and I'm thinking, oh, God, what did I do? He said, my niece is autistic. I need a copy of your literature. She needs to know this is a career option.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And it was one of the best memories.
Yeah.
And for the disability awareness and pride too, because a kid who's maybe fighting with their school the way this is what Nicki's law practice is very often is advocating for kids with disabilities when their schools aren't providing what they're legally obligated to. Kids doing that might not think, well, I could never go to college and get an undergraduate degree and then get a law degree. But having examples of folks like Nicki who have done that can show them a path. As Amber likes to say, you can't be it unless you see it. Did I get that right?
Yeah. And again, that's, along with Pride Months and Heritage Months, same thing, is that this is this opportunity for us for folks when this isn't always a centered identity marker, right? In life, in the world, in our culture, in our space, it's not always centered. And so giving this the time to celebrate the culture, like if it's a cultural heritage month, celebrate and amplify our culture, and also look at the representation and see like where else do we see the progress and the things that my people have and my ancestors have made and contributed, or LGBTQ plus folks or those that have disabilities, and what things have they contributed to who we are and how we are as a society, and where are the places that I can go, and what are the kids that have similar identity markers to me that might look at me and be able to see like, oh, I can be a professor, I can be a psychologist, I can be these things.
Like a little known fact, Helen Keller was the co-founder of the ACLU.
Right.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yep. It's huge. Anyway, well, thank you all. I think that was a great conversation about the question. So as we round out our podcast for today is our skill. So Will, what's our skill?
So our habit breaking skill for today. So remember our acronym MATE, motivation, awareness, tools, and effort. We're going to focus in on one of those tools. And that tool is to think ahead. So biases happen most often when we're in kind of an ambiguous or spontaneous sort of state. Like I encourage people to think of, when was the last time you had a difficult conversation with someone? Did you just jump into it and kind of fly by the seat of your pants? If so, it probably didn't go as well as if you had stepped back and kind of thought it through before you were in the situation. What do I want to get out of this conversation? What do I want to come to an understanding with about this person or with this person? When we think things through ahead of time, it's much more likely that our actions, our words, and so on will be more in line with our intentions and less likely to fall prey to biases.
Right.
And this is something that research consistently shows. If you think things through ahead of time, commit to what your priorities are, there's less bias down the road. This is especially true for hiring kinds of situations, as was our central topic. Research shows if you kind of, as a hiring committee, think through what are we looking for in a candidate, it stops or prevents many of the kind of flip-floppy or more ambiguous bias-related processes that can play out in hiring. And so this idea of kind of thinking things through ahead of time, one other kind of term for it is called committing to credentials. So if we're looking to hire someone who has a particular set of academic credentials, a particular set of past skills, and so on, thinking through and committing to what you're looking for ahead of time is a way to prevent bias, because if we haven't committed to credentials ahead of time, hadn't thought ahead about what we want, we kind of jump into the situation. We start forming impressions, and our gut feelings start influencing our judgments much more. And our gut feelings very often are going to be to favor someone who looks like or it has the same demographics as our mental image or the stereotype of someone in that position.
One, a lot of the, again, bingo, cultural inertia and the colonized views too, right? So thinking about like, what is this kind of default baseline of what I'm looking for, rather than saying like, are there other things that I'm looking for specifically, values and ways of being that I'm looking for that I can be really intentionally being on the lookout, right? Rather than just defaulting to what has always been or what who the past leaders have looked like and what that is, rather than saying this is also an opportunity for me to decolonize practice, have a decolonized practice of saying like, what are the various ways in which this can manifest? And what are the values that we're looking for? What are the characteristics and the way a person interacts or whatever that I'm really looking for, and think about that intentionally ahead of time, rather than allowing our bias and the cultural inertia and the ways in which things have always been to be the default guide.
There was a video that I posted on the 4th of July from John Cena that talked about what the average American is and what is your mental picture. He said, you're all wrong. 61% of the country is female.
Yeah.
So most of
61?
I believe he said 61. It could have been 51.
It's usually, I mean, the general demographic worldwide is 51.
So then it was
for the
51.
U.S.,
But for the U.S., maybe it's different.
For the U.S.,
women live longer generally, so that.
But it was really interesting.
There's someone who checking that.
Yeah.
I didn't think about it.
That's really good.
I had never.
And probably older. Like if you, I would bet most people's picture of average, not just white and straight and everything, but probably male
older.
and probably younger.
Yeah.
But the real average would be older.
So thinking ahead.
So with regard to the thinking ahead and this committing to credentials ahead of time, it also can be committing to forms of flexibility. So for instance, sometimes people think so in a school type context, like I used to hire research assistants for my lab. People will be like, well, something will look for objective criteria like GPA.
Right.
So I know of one professor, someone who I do very much respect and love, and she's a champion for equity and equality. But she had a hard GPA requirement. She only accepted research assistants with 4.0s. And she was like, look, 4.0, it shows they have committed, they've put in the work, they're smart, not saying it's the only thing, but this has always worked for me. So every single research assistant of hers was 4.0. That didn't sit right with me as I was thinking of how I was wanted to do my hiring. And of course, GPA means something. For sure. And I think means something important. I don't think you should completely ignore it. But here's the rule I made. It was a rule with built-in flexibility. I looked a lot at GPA. And if your GPA was high, you probably were definitely were much more likely to get an interview. But I did not eliminate anyone for a low GPA, and I had this caveat. If someone has a low GPA, but they mentioned it in their application. If they mentioned it, if they said, hey, my GPA is low, here's why. I know I have a low GPA, but please still consider me because of this. Any kind of mention of the low. For my policy, absolutely 100% that person gets an interview. Might not be a good fit on other things and so on. They always got an interview. And I got some of my absolute best students out of that. And one in particular, I'm not going to name him because I don't want to embarrass that he had a low GPA at one point, but it was low. And he said, I was a pre-engineering or an engineering major. Turns out that was not right for me. If you look at the last 2 semesters, my GPA is this, and I am really motivated. I really want to work in your lab. He went on, he did an honor senior thesis in my lab, won an award for it, scholarship award with me for it, a Hilldale scholarship it's called at UW-Madison. Went on, got into graduate school, got his PhD in social psychology. Nice. Which is what mine was in. So kind of, and now he is a tenured professor of social psychology.
Oh, it's amazing.
And like those are his accomplishments. I don't want to be like, oh, I hired him, so blah, blah, blah. But like it shows all that potential. You would have
missed out, right? You would have missed out.
I would have missed out on his wonderful contributions.
Yeah.
But I say that because sometimes when we talk about some of these skills, some people are like, well, they're hard and fast rules. It's like, no, that's why we call them skills, to think. And so thinking ahead can include that flexibility, I love that. Knowing that these so-called objective criteria aren't as objective as we think. Nikki, it's 51% women, but thank you, Roman, for double checking.
I appreciate
it.
But no matter what, the whole idea of what's the average American, it's going to be a little more likely to be female women.
I'm like, wait.
Yeah.
I didn't think of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a term for this that we've used other times. There's kind of the idea of the straight white male default,
Right?
Yeah.
That everything is kind of a deviation from that, and so that's often the blank slate that we start with.
Yep.
What else? Okay. Also, the thinking ahead. It can be about terminology. This is something that we talk about a lot, like the "you guys" example that I've revisited, saying "you all" instead of "you guys." There's also kind of a bias story that I use in the training. A colleague of mine who is a gender bias researcher. She was in a medical emergency with another woman, but the other woman really seemed to have some medical knowledge. And my colleague asked this woman, "Oh, are you a nurse?" Turns out she was a doctor. Very kind of common, kind of quick biased, gender biased kind of assumption, assuming that a woman in a medical context is a nurse rather than a doctor.
Right.
Well, my colleague used this think ahead tool, really thought, like, if I'm ever in that situation, what would I have preferred to have said? Because also asking someone if they're a doctor is putting an assumption into the question.
Right.
And she decided that after she kind of made this mistake and was kind of embarrassed about it, that from that day forward, she was like, I'm going to say, are you a medical professional? Yeah. Because that's really what the question's getting at. The person could be a paramedic or a nurse or a doctor or something else, or maybe not a medical professional, and they're just like think they know what they're doing when they really don't. But so thinking
which is also helpful to know.
Yeah, very. So if they say no, I'm not, but
I watch a lot of Grey's Anatomy.
I watch it on TV.
But so thinking through how I want to ask that question before you're in the situation and things are tense or you're fumbling to figure it out in the moment, thinking things through ahead of time, great way to prevent bias. And it especially kind of fits with a lot of this hiring stuff. So thinking about, are we asking about lived experiences, how those lived experiences could connect with our students in an educational context, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Thinking ahead.
I love that. Yeah, I think the thinking ahead and the built-in flexibility, both like having those together in conjunction makes this a really robust way of thinking about this. And again, giving the room for, we're not telling everybody what to do. We're just saying like, here, having that built-in flexibility allows for you to say like, what does this look like? How do I have some guidelines, but then have the freedom and flexibility to adjust when I have a really good reason to adjust, right?
And the flexibility is, under circumstances X, Y, Z, I would have flexibility A, B, C. It's not just like, oh, I thought ahead that I wanted this. Now I just throw it out because that likely would favor bias as well.
That's not helpful either.
Right. Yeah. But it's flexibility that has the intention behind it. Again, reducing bias is about bringing our behavior and our decisions in line with our best and most well thought out intentions.
Yeah. Absolutely. Excellent. Yeah, that's a great skill. Thank you, Will.
Yeah.
And as we land this ship, Nicki, what is your joyful recommendation for us?
My joyful recommendation is the music of Dolly Parton. She was a trailblazer. She is a trailblazer. Her work on literacy to make sure that every kid 5 and under can read and provides. You could sign up and you get a book. You get books.
Yeah. And so all the royalties she got from "I Will Always Love You" from Whitney's Whitney Houston's cover of that song, she donated to help inner city Black youth. With literacy, I think, or with something. And she also is the reason we had a COVID vaccine, right?
Yes,
she donated
the
money.
proceeds so that we could get one of the COVID vaccines, and that's amazing. Yeah. And funny fact on "I Will Always Love You," everyone thinks it was written as a love song. It wasn't. It was written to Porter Wagner from Dolly Parton when Dolly wanted to get out of her contract and their partnership agreement. And he felt she was abandoning her, and she felt she couldn't talk to him, so she wrote that.
I always love you. Interesting. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so you love her music, you listen to it a lot?
I listen to it a lot because she has a way and a perspective of looking at things that's much more worldly without being preachy. You listen to 9 to 5.
Yeah.
They take your work and never give you credit. These kind of things are actual situations.
These real human experiences 100%. And social issues.
Yes. Yeah. I think she's somebody that's really pushed agendas or pushed for representation in ways that you don't necessarily think about immediately, but even just her willingness or her tenacity to just be herself and how she presents. And she talks about like, you know, her hair and how she dresses and all of these things.
It takes a lot of money to look this cheap.
Exactly. You know, that she really has been somebody that's fought for women, has fought for inclusion, has fought for literacy, has fought for so many in ways that are just masterful in how she does it. And her music is fun and upbeat and it's country, but I don't know that I've ever really considered her country, you know, like she's just kind of an island of her own, right?
Trendsetter.
Well,
yeah.
The Coat of Many Colors actually is one of the first songs I ever really attached to as someone who was bullied at school, although not for lack of finances, but for other reasons. Yeah. I understood. I understand with the whole class laughing at someone and that. Yeah. And it felt like she understood.
Yeah. She's incredible. So the music of Dolly Parton.
Yes.
What a great recommendation.
I'm sure it's streaming all the places you get music.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Next time you feel like listening to something, put some on and feel some joy. Got to bring everyone joy with that.
Awesome.
All right. Well, I'm Dr. William Cox.
And I'm Dr. Amber Nelson.
And today's guest was
Nicki Vander Meulen.
Diverse Joy is produced by Eric Roman Binding with music by Jay Arner. It is accessible as a video podcast on YouTube or an audio-only podcast wherever you get podcasts or at diversejoy.com. Also follow us at Diverse Joy on most social media platforms. If you enjoy the show, help us reach more people by leaving 5-star reviews or recommending it personally. Word of mouth is by far, far, far the best way that podcasts reach more people, and so it really helps us out. Diverse Joy is the official podcast of Inequity Agents of Change, a nonprofit devoted to evidence-based approaches to reduce bias, create inclusion, and promote equity. All that good Jedi work. Learn more at biashabit.com. Thank you for joining us. Now, go find your joy.
Bye.
Bye. I don't know if I have an answer. Good. I hadn't thought it through as well as I thought.